Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Dempster with 360 Public Affairs, and it's my pleasure to welcome everyone who took the time this afternoon to take part in this webinar on new data from two of Canada's leading research firms, Ipsos Canada and Research, etc. I'm going to be moderating today's panel, and there are just a couple of quick housekeeping notes I want to make before we get started. First, you can download copies in English and French of the research reports that are going to be presented and talked about today. So there's a handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel that you'll see on the right. Feel free to pull them off if you want to follow along that way. Second, this is hopefully going to be interactive and engaging. And it's not just the 5 people you see on screen who are going to be contributing to this webinar. I'm hoping many of you will be as well. So you'll see that there's a questions panel. As your questions come to you or your comments, please feel free to enter them there, and I'll do my best to bring them forward, sometimes grouping them together, time permitting. Okay, let's get right to our panelists for today's webinar. So, Dr. Jason Field is President and CEO of Life Sciences Ontario. And as many of you know, Jason has been a bench scientist, a government official, and since 2011, so that's 10 years now at LSO, Jason, a life sciences sector champion at the provincial and national levels. Mike Colledge is president of Ipsos Canada, which he joined in 1997, drawing on experience in social and economic portfolios of the Government of Canada. Mike covers a wide range of sectors and issues that touch on public and private sector communications, government policy, and program development. And at Ipsos, Mike and his team help clients better understand the world around them. Rachelle Deshaies is Senior Market Research Executive and one of the principals of Research, etc., where she draws on 20 years research experience and helps lead a team of quantitative and qualitative data experts. And Rachelle's creative thinking and observation has helped LSO over the past year or so look at projects that take the pulse of a sector or issue with really useful data, and I think you're going to see that today in spades. Lastly, we've got Jennifer Chan, Vice President, Policy and External Affairs with Merck Canada, and she has served on Merck's executive team since December of 2011. Jennifer is going to help kick off or moderate a discussion among panelists in the Q&A with all of you today. Like Jason, Jennifer started her career in academic research and has extensive experience in regulatory and medical affairs roles in the industry. And in addition to serving on several regional life sciences boards, Jennifer was one of just a handful of pharmaceutical leaders on the federal government's Health and Biosciences Economic Strategy Table, also known as HBEST, and has had a very close-up perspective on the federal medicine price regulations as they've been brought forward over the past few years. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jason to help explain what we're doing here and what we're going to hear. Here you go, Jason.
Well, thank you, Bill, and thanks for pointing out that I've been with LSO for 10 years now. If I didn't feel old before, I certainly do now, but it actually has been, a really great part of my career, the time I've spent with LSO, and very rewarding to see how this industry has evolved over the past decade. You know, since 2017, when PMPRB first proposed these changes, LSO has been involved, and the reason that we got involved early on, there were two things about the proposed changes that stuck out to me. One was that even though it's framed as pharmaceutical pricing, the impacts and potential impacts go far beyond pharma companies. It really has the potential to impact the entire life sciences ecosystem here in Ontario and across Canada. And it will impact patients and Canadians across our nation. So that was an important element for us to get involved. The second thing that really stuck out to me, and this is probably, Bill, because I'm both a scientist and a former public servant, was that right away it became evident to me that the PMPRB's approach to these changes were not rooted in sound evidence-based policymaking. Rather, it was very much a predetermined target and outcome, and they were then building the evidence to support the outcome that they were desiring. And I don't think that that is a good way to do public policy. Certainly not a good way to do science, but definitely not a good way to do public policy either. So that's why right from day one, we have engaged with several third-party research organizations to really ask them for their help to give a credible and rigorous data-driven perspective on the PMPRB issue. And so last year, we worked with IQVIA to show that, in 2019, we only saw 13 globally launched medicines available here when we should have seen more like 30. And this was a significant decline over previous years. And we do contribute that to the launch of the entire process around these changing PMPRB regulations. It also showed that market size wasn't the only determinant in how drugs are launched and come to market. China was a great example of this. Huge market, but they often don't see medicines come in a timely way because it's a complex and uncertain environment. And now here we are with a level of uncertainty that I think is unprecedented in terms of the Canadian market. So this data was quite alarming. And it encouraged us to continue our research and find out what is happening in the industry and how Canadians feel about it. And that's really the genesis of the reports that we're here to talk about today. I believe these are really important and timely discussions, particularly given the context of COVID-19. I mean, I don't want to get into details around vaccine procurement and deployment. But what I can say is that leading up to this pandemic, there really has been a disconnect between senior government officials, being amenable to frank and candid discussions with the life sciences industry. And this breakdown and disconnect is at a time where we really need a collaborative approach. And fortunately, I think both sides have set aside differences, at least for the time being, to focus on COVID-19. The other element of COVID-19 that really needs to be called out is that, despite the federal government saying throughout this process that these regulations won't impact the timely access to medicines, they went out of their way to, number one, exclude the COVID vaccines from the PMPRB regulations, which to me was very telling that they thought that it could be a factor in delaying access. What we're seeing in Ottawa really is not happening across the country. We are seeing in the Ontario government, for example, that life sciences and the pharmaceuticals industry, they're key pillars for economic growth. We've seen that, in recent announcement around Invest Ontario and Supply Ontario, life sciences sectors are at the forefront and they're priority sectors. Right before New Year's, we saw the federal government, ISED, launch a report around their economic recovery plan. And there's barely any mention of the life sciences sector, the one sector that's going to actually rescue us from this current economic crisis that we're in. So I think, there's a real disconnect between what's happening in industry and government, and that really needs to be fixed. So, I want to be optimistic. I think the pandemic has created an opportunity for us to build bridges with government. We've shown that we can collaborate together around common goals, and we share a common goal when it comes to sustainability, long-term affordability, and access to medicine for Canadian patients. So I'm hopeful that the discussions we have here today, the data that's being presented, will really form the basis for constructive discussions going forward.
Thanks, Jason. That's a great way to kick us off and explain some of the context around it. We're going to turn our cameras off, and Mike, it's all over to you to walk us through some of the Ipsos data and what you found.
Thanks, Jason, and thank you, Bill. So when we first started to go down this path, obviously, we took a look at this, and this is a very complex issue. And as Jason noted, it's a complex issue that is starting to gain traction, but Canadians are very much, when you talk to them about sort of the world today and where they are looking at through one lens and one lens only, and that is the COVID lens and now the vaccine lens and how that's rolling out, and have a very short-term view of the world. So what we did is, if you go to the next page, please, is we went out and we did a short, short public opinion survey, fairly standard methodology. I won't go into great detail on it. It was a sample of 1,000. Our standard approach to doing online surveys, it's what we do when you see our national surveys released, fairly rigorous, plus or minus 2.5%. And it's the basic way you do it when we do a vote, et cetera, between elections. So it's a rigorous approach, nationally represented, weighted to the census. If we go to the next slide, please. I think we can skip the next slide. This is executive summary, which I will talk about. This is a fairly short survey, and I will cover all of this as we go through. The next one. So the first thing we did is we wanted to look at what for lack of a better description, the overall non-COVID health priorities were or are. We know if we go and ask people what the health priorities are right now, it's COVID, it's vaccines, it's distribution, it's getting out. So we left those out, and we put forward a list of things to Canadians that were ongoing before and will likely be ongoing afterwards. And what you can see is we asked them to rank either these in their top rankings, and the rankings for second or third. And what you can see is at the top of this list is addressing the challenges of long-term care. Obviously, there were problems, and people saw this before. We know in the polling we did beforehand that people saw concerns and angst around this has been amplified and accelerated by COVID. A tier down from that, addressing the challenges around our hospitals, acute care, addressing time to surgery. Again, these were issues that people saw as challenges before, and COVID has added on top of this by pushing some of those back a little further. And then in this third tier is where you can see this issue of further regulating prices of medicine, along with addressing mental health and addiction issues. The mental health and addiction issues have been on the rise incredibly over the last 8 months with COVID. And you can see really this issue that we're talking about today, that further regulating of prices, falls mid-tier in the others. And then you can see a number of other ones down there that I won't go into a lot. The notion around regulating prices, affordability, has always been. So I'm not surprised to see the mid-tier because it's the same for other issues. People look across government and they want affordable or cost-conscious education, infrastructure, et cetera. So it's not surprising to see it there. We go to the next slide, please. You mentioned, Jason, that this is, since 2017, this issue has been in debate. So one of the things we wanted to do was go out and ask Canadians, do you know what PMPRB is? Have you heard about it? And what you see is about 3 in 10 who say, I have, 7% say, yes, I know about it. About 3 in 10 who say they have some knowledge, and about half of Canadians who say they have next to no knowledge. So despite this issue, and when we sat down to talk to you guys, getting a lot of play within industry, getting a lot of play within the communities that are most likely affected by it, it's very unlikely to have reached down into the core in the conversations. I'm sure my mom, who stays in tune with the news, on a regular basis, has health concerns and has certain views around the world, probably hasn't heard of it or seen it. So you get the average Canadian probably not aware as much as they could be. They understand there's some form of regulation, and it's really hard in this kind of a public environment climate to get traction and get understanding for an issue like this when all of the coverage is focused on one big issue, and that being COVID and the economic recovery. If we go to the next slide, please. Despite the fact that it had PMRB in the overall has a very low knowledge, we wanted to see how many Canadians might be touched by this initiative and where it was going. So we asked people, do you have personal, either within your family or your own self, serious illness that's required medication? Dead split in the country. Half of Canadians saying yes, half of Canadians saying no. Not surprisingly, those Canadians who are older, more likely, around 6 in 10, to say I have that experience with. And this is something, despite the low knowledge of what's happening in the issue, very much likely to see a lot of interest down the road because the population is aging. And as well, as Jason noted, the debate around COVID, around vaccines in general, is likely to elevate this more down the road, not necessarily right now, but down the road as more and more people start to experience it. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So in a perfect world, if you ask Canadians what they want when it comes down to almost all of the programs that governments deliver and the regulations they do, is they want to see access and affordability. They want to see them get good service at a good price. But in reality, there's often a trade-off. It's either pulled from one section of government, the cost, to another, or there's an overall price increase. So what we wanted to do was really lay out for Canadians both sides of this, the affordability angle as well as the access issue, and put them head to head against each other. And what you can see when you do that is 72% agree, 22% disagree, that they would rather see access to new drugs, new medicines to cover those key illnesses like arthritis and diabetes, cancer, et cetera, even if it meant at a higher price. On the flip side, when you flip that statement around, it's around 41% agree, 52% disagree. And again, not surprisingly, because we know how the world breaks out, younger people who haven't had as much involvement, haven't had as much contact, more likely to lean towards sort of, I think there needs some affordability. But older Canadians are the biggest part of the population that's growing. And as they get older and as they see more and more of their friends need it, their contacts, their neighbors, more likely to say, access is crucially important on this issue. If we just go ahead. So essentially on this issue, I think what we're seeing is a real challenge for it to get sort of a full airing in the public. I don't think it's been fully debated, fully baked and formed debate, despite being around since 2017. And if you had to pick an area where it was going to lean because of COVID, because of the increased promise of vaccine, because of an aging society, I suspect you see it lean more and more as the world moves on in towards that access over affordability. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mike. So now I'm going to welcome Rachelle to walk us through her report. Here are a couple of background slides on Ipsos, but over to you, Rachelle, and then we'll take it to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. And so what I'm going to be walking you through, and we can go to the first slide of mine, I want to talk to you about what we did in our research. Now, our research, unlike Mike's, which was focused on Canadians themselves, we wanted to understand what were pharmaceutical representatives, pharmaceutical executives thinking and feeling. How was this impacting the companies, the pharmaceutical companies and their business plans? So we had three objectives. We wanted to understand what's the familiarity. So Mike had familiarity in his with consumers. We wanted to also see what's the level of familiarity with these the changes to price controls. We asked the global and Canadian pharmaceutical decision makers. We also wanted to understand what was then their likely response. Have they already made decisions? Have they already had a response to these changes? And are they likely to have a response to these changes? And the areas we were trying to understand was around business overall, but on specific types in terms of the business. Decisions on bringing products to Canada, so launching products. Decisions on investing in ways of clinical trials, for example, or hiring people, or providing patient support programs or enhancements to patient support programs. We wanted to understand that because there is this hypothesis that has been put out by PMPRB that the new pricing changes will have no negative impacts on access to medicines and investments in Canada. So that's the hypothesis, and we wanted to see whether the respondents within our survey agreed or confirmed that hypothesis or refuted that hypothesis. So if we go to the next slide, we had a two-part methodology. Now, unlike a large sample size that was just shown to you, this is a very small industry, and so we actually got 43, which sounds small, but it actually is quite a large representation because this is a small group of individuals. So these were 43 senior pharmaceutical executives, some of them presidents, GMs, EVPs, and that we had them from Canadian affiliates of global companies, parent companies based outside of Canada, and parent companies based in Canada. They completed a 10-minute online survey, and that was in early December. And then in mid to late December, I followed up with some of those surveys, and I had a telephone one-on-one in-depth 30 minutes with 10 of those who have completed study, because I wanted to dig into some of the answers that they had provided to add some insight and some color commentary to understand the whys behind the answers that they were giving to me. And we had a nice mix of larger companies and smaller companies in that qualitative follow-up. I conducted the interviews myself, and I can share some of those insights. I have lots of comments in here, some of the verbatim, some of the actual language, and what the senior executives had articulated to me. So if we go to the next slide. So the very first question we asked in the survey, just like Mike had asked, what's your level of familiarity with this issue? And we had explained, there was this, that regulations have been passed, and we're going to be seeing some changes. How familiar are you with this, the changes coming? And unlike what we saw in the Canadian study with the Canadians, here we see that virtually all of them are not just familiar, but very familiar. This is a hot topic. It's a #1 topic within the pharmaceutical industry. And one of the things when I was talking to them in the telephone conversations was, what's with this hot button issue? A lot of them pointed to uncertainty. It's the uncertainty in the marketplace that is causing a lot of conversation. What do we do? What are the decisions that we make based on this uncertainty? And so the next slide that I have is a little bit busy. There's lots of words here, but I just wanted to communicate that, there was discussion around what Jason had talked about at the beginning was the COVID-19 vaccine and therapeutics exemption to PMPRB pricing reform. And so there was, when I was talking to the follow-up telephone interviews, talking about why this is such a hot button topic. Well, it has been sustained throughout the year, but it also happened to be that just at the end of November, the president of Pfizer Canada had put out an op-ed called Lessons from the Pandemic. You may have seen that article. And that article talks about, I have a little excerpt from it here on the left. And in it, he says, the reality is, had the government applied its new pricing guidelines to COVID-19 vaccine candidates, our ability to move at the speed of science would have been restricted. Think of the implications of that on today's society. And he also wrote in here that future innovation breakthrough treatments, that if Canada needs to have regulatory and pricing frameworks that encourage and fosters early access, that would lead to something like we've seen with the breakthrough in the COVID-19 vaccines. If we put restrictions on that, what happens? And so I was speaking with some of these decision makers, and this has come out. And so when we were talking about this, there was a lot of comments on, could you imagine if these COVID vaccines were available in the US, the UK, and Europe, and we didn't have them in Canada? Just imagine what that would be like. And Canadians would be furious if that were to happen. That would be an ill-thought, malicious policy. And then some of them pointed to the fact that how bad, this third quote on the right, how bad do your policies have to be to say that our policies won't apply to COVID life-saving medicine? And so then the question is, well, what about oncology patients? What about rare disease patients? Why aren't they the exception? Or why do we have this rule at all? And so it does, the last comment, which I think is important, it proves that if you need innovation, then this process is inhibiting that. So I think some of those comments really help to frame out where we are right now with this issue. And if we go to the next slide, one of the questions in the survey was very much around this: what therapeutic areas would the PMPRB changes impact? And here you can see that there are many therapeutic areas that could potentially be negatively impacted. Two that really pop out: oncology and rare disease, which that speaker previously had mentioned. And in speaking with this, one of the pharma reps that executives that I spoke to said, I feel emotional about it because it's not just COVID. 1 in 2 Canadians by 2013 will be confronted with cancer, and 1 in 4 will die from it. We can't be a tier 1 country if we have this brutal policy. And the comments around rare disease, it feels like it's arbitrary pricing hurdles and use common sense. So I think those are some of the issues expressed, but it can really cascade around different therapeutic options, including vaccines. So if we go to the next slide, we ask, we wanted to, again, one of the objectives was to measure the impact, whether that impact has already happened or whether that impact is likely to happen. So the question was, what's the impact on overall business plans? And so you can see that virtually all said it would have a negative impact on business plans in Canada. And then on the right, it's specifically, well, which types of, which plans in particular. Product launch is, again, virtually all had pointed to product launch. And I'm going to show you a little bit more detail on that. But other things, innovation, investment, employment, how many people are we going to bring into the company based on this? Clinical research, are we going to have clinical trials attracted to Canada as a result? And other things, intellectual property, compassionate access. Would we put patients on a product if we're not sure if that product is coming to Canada? And patient support programs. So it looks like the impacts from the perspective of our decision makers, it looks like the impact will be negative if, as we proceed forward with these pricing changes. If we go to the next slide. We wanted to drill down a little bit into some of these different areas. So one of the things that I talked to you about was product launches. And we saw that virtually all of them had said, yes, it's going to have a negative impact. Well, here we ask a question, have you already decided not to bring products to Canada? Or are you thinking of not doing that? That's important. So this is, I have in the next slide I talked to you about, it's about delay of products. This one is actually not bringing them here. So in this case, when you look at this, virtually all said, yep, this is going to be something that's going to happen in Canada, that there will be decisions not to launch products. And in fact, almost a third of them, 30%, so they've already made this decision that they're not going to bring some products to Canada as a result. And, and we tried to color some with quotes from those telephone interviews. And we can see that, we'll be forced to withdraw a product from market and not proceed with the launch of another one. And that was just one speaker. So in some cases, there were several products where the decision was made not to bring it. And then I would ask, why is that? And they explained, the parent company and potential partners, they feel like it's too risky, like there's too much pricing risk. It's this lack of uncertainty and what's going to happen. And if Canada, is not going to be a priority country for the launch, then they can proceed with more certainty. If Canada becomes part of that early launch, there's an uncertainty around what's the impact going to be? How is that going to affect our larger business concerns? So there is some real impacts here that we foresee. And if we go to the next slide, this one speaks to product launch delays. So, maybe they're going to bring it, but will it be here in the time that they thought it would be here? And here it's virtually all, again, 94% said yes, this will happen. And third said it's already happened. So, the launch timing of new products is being challenged in our organization because, again, of that uncertainty. And here we have some very specific, what I wanted to do in this with the one-on-one was to ask real things that have happened. Tell me an instance. What does that mean? Because I wanted to really understand, is this really happening? And so at least one product launch was delayed in one of the quotes here and may not launch due to changes. So it's delayed, will it launch? And 2 new product launches are on permanent delay, and that has an impact on employment, clinical trials. And I want to get into that because that's what the next slide actually addresses. And so I use this image on purpose. It has a purpose. which is that if we think of the red ball as a decision not to bring product or to delay product, what impact does that have on the rest of the decisions? Because these decisions aren't made in isolation. It's a cascade effect. So once you take that ball and you decide, it has a cascade or a ripple effect along to other decision points, because of course revenue is generated from the products. If you're not bringing products here or you're delaying products here, that's going to impact all the other decisions down the road in terms of, can you hire people? Do you have a product to support, right? Can you bring a clinical trial here? Are you going to invest in patient support programs? Are you going to invest in innovation here? Because there's a cascade effect. So I thought some of these quotes that again, it's a little bit busy, and especially if you have a small screen, but I think some of these quotes are really important to sort of, I didn't really understand the decision-making processes that went into this. And so when you start to understand how the business decisions are made, it becomes clear in terms of why this is happening. And I think one of the quotes that's great, and it's actually below the image, we have to also remember that the decision makers at these pharmaceutical companies, they're also human beings who have sometimes very personal stakes in what's happening, And this speaker really articulated his job, how he saw his job, and he didn't see his job to sell products. What he saw his job was to compete. He had to compete for a limited pool of funds from his parent company, and he needed to compete with the UK division, the German division of the same company. So he's wanting to say, come to Canada, bring the opportunities here. And his German counterpart is saying, no, come to Germany. And the UK counterpart, come here. So that's really interesting to understand how those decisions are made. And if I'm the parent company, I'll be like, why would I go to Canada? They're having all kinds of issues. I'll go to Germany. It's more clear. I'll go to the UK. It's more clear. So that's an interesting to put ourselves in the shoes of those decision makers, which is what this part of the project was about, was to understand that mindset and the decision making. So some of the other quotes that I think are interesting is in terms of how this uncertainty is having a negative impact down the road. So it might not be the case today that some of these decisions have been made. So the ball hasn't quite reached the other ones. But the thought here is, what's going to happen in 2021, 2022? How will the decisions be impacting? We're going to see a longer tail of impacts that will affect certain things. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk about employment as a good example. So we can see that, the question here was, do you foresee or have you already experienced deferring or canceling the hiring of staff due to the pricing reform? And again, almost all said yes. And again, a third have already made that. So we're seeing consistency here, aren't we? Right? So the story is, if we don't bring the product or we delay the product, we don't invest in the people. And if we think about the larger impacts, the ripple that might have in the Canadian economy, these are very high-paying jobs. They involve Canadian brain power. They are a really good job, and that they also they're contributors to taxpayers. And so this is what the CEOs were articulating to me, what the senior decision makers were articulating to me, is we've had to reduce those hires. So, for instance, the one example was that this was a direct result of a 30% reduction in staff, which was 160 people in this particular case. And that was in 2018 because of uncertainty, and then again in 2019. So we see, 30 hires in 2018, 130 in 2019. And the other instance in here was that they're looking at downsizing as much as 50%. So I think that that's really important for us to understand, is the larger impacts. And then another slide that I have is the final message. And I'm happy to see the slides because I think this is important to share what some of those, if I said, I asked them, if you could tell the Canadian government just one thing about their changes, what would you say? And, they pointed out some things like this isn't good for Canadians, both in the short term and the long term. We're not going to be an attractive market for decisions, for investments, for employment, for all kinds of things that contribute to the economic well-being of the country. And, some of the other things was this is going to impact patient accessibility. We're going to fall behind, and we're not going to be with the other G7 nations. We're not going to be in that top tier or two. We're going to fall down to be with other countries that we wouldn't normally associate ourselves with in terms of healthcare. So that's the voice of the decision makers that I was here to represent. And I'll pass it back over to Bill.
Thanks so much, Rachelle. And I'm going to actually invite everyone to jump back on the screen with their cameras on. And I'm going to take the screen share off for now so that we can just have a good chat, maybe starting with you, Jennifer. Do you want to react to what you've been presented, or what we've all been presented in terms of the new research reports? Does that resonate with your experience, and is there anything else that you can add as an executive in the pharmaceutical sector that would maybe further color it?
Sure. Thanks very much, Bill. And I actually just wanted to first start off by thanking you, Jason, for LSO's contributions and leadership on this PMPRB issue over the past several years. And thank you, Mike and Rachelle, for bringing forward these very important research findings. These findings really add to the growing body of data that's out there that really fundamentally shows why these PMPRB reforms are so problematic. So, Bill, I'll just take a few minutes, as you suggested, just to provide some reactions to these findings and perspectives in regards to the PMPRB reform. So first, starting with the Ipsos, the public opinion poll findings. So I'm really not surprised that Canadians favor timely access to the newest innovative medicines. And especially given the current COVID-19 context, I think all Canadians can now really relate to having to wait anxiously for a new life-saving therapeutic to come to Canada. And I think in many respects, the COVID situation has really provided Canadians with a better appreciation and understanding of how price and timely access to new treatments are, in fact, related. And we've seen, like in other countries that are prepared to pay competitive prices for COVID-19 vaccines, they've been able to secure reliable access to these vaccines. So I think one main issue that the COVID context has really highlighted has been both, competitive prices and some degree of market certainty. And we've been hearing a lot about that in terms of this market certainty. So in fact, these very same principles actually apply for other therapeutics and other disease areas. So for example, and I think Rachelle, your data has shown this, there are many exciting new treatments that are expected to come to market in the near future. But unfortunately, many of these may not be immediately available to Canadians because of these new price controls. And this is the huge problem. And I think what the Ipsos data has shown us is that at the end of the day, Canadians want and they deserve to be able to have access to a vaccine or a medicine if they need it. And I think, decision makers, they should be acting in the interest of all Canadians, and they really need to recognize this. Now, just a quick reaction to the Research Etc. survey that Rachelle took us through. So I think likewise, the results of the Research Etc. data are also unsurprising given the level of the uncertainty that's really being created by these new federal pricing rules. And so just at a very basic level, launching a new medicine in Canada, it requires significant time, commitment, human resources, and costs millions of dollars. And so now with the new reforms, it's really hard to predict to what extent these investments can actually produce revenues. because of the uncertainty that's associated with the PMPRB changes. And the way the PMPRB plans to implement the reforms is very opaque. Companies, small, medium, large, all of us, we have to navigate through a labyrinth of complicated formulas and processes, again, with no real clarity about how they will even be applied. So if we don't actually know how to price our products, there are very obvious questions that all of us in the local affiliates that are being raised by our global headquarters that makes it very difficult for us as a Canadian subsidiary to really make a compelling business case to prioritize the Canadian market. And so this impacts decisions on new medicine launches and also for research investments such as clinical trials, as we've seen in the research, et cetera, data. So frankly, there is a lot at stake here. And these new PMPRB rules are forcing many companies to essentially make really difficult decisions that, that they don't want to make. But I'm an eternal optimist, and I think, there is maybe some good news here, or maybe an opportunity. So we now have just under 5 months before the new federal regulations are scheduled to come into effect. My hope is that the federal government can use this time to come forward with a more pragmatic and balanced approach to drug pricing. I truly believe this is an opportunity to reset and just reconsider the overall approach. So back to you, Bill.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, and I appreciate the reactions because they come from a place of having a ringside seat on this right from the beginning. And we could say the same thing for Jason, but maybe the best thing that's come out of this research project, from what I can see, is that Mike and Rachelle, you work in different sectors, and often, I'll turn it to Mike really briefly in terms of this has taken a fair amount of time to explain some of the challenges and issues around it. Mike, how does this translate to everyday Canadians or somebody on Main Street, or as you mentioned, your mom? Or does it? And then if it doesn't easily, what do you any recommendations on how to make this stick?
Well, I think Jennifer touched on some of the how to make it stick in her comments, but we as humans, we always default today over tomorrow. That's why we choose chocolate cake over a diet. It's human nature. And when you frame this as affordability today, people go, well, that makes perfect sense. But I think we're seeing with COVID and discussion around the vaccine play out in the reverse, right? Because the arguments against, or the challenge we're facing today with access and distribution are based on decisions governments made, if not months ago, years ago, on capability and opportunities and investment, where we put manufacturing and commitment to these industries. And Canadians do expect if they are going to vote for today in themselves in their day-to-day activities, they elect governments to think ahead for them. And so you don't want to see this play out. But to Jennifer's point about all these other, once COVID is done, you're going to see a lot of mini vaccine deficits likely happen in oncology, in diabetes, and all of these new breakthroughs. And that's where those challenges, where people will look back and say, maybe it's not the widespread COVID thing, but pocket by pocket, person by person, will start to experience those deficits and defaults. And that's the challenge. How do you bring what the evidence that Rachelle put forward is going to happen in tomorrow into today's conversation?
And maybe I'll turn it over. Thanks, Mike. Over to you, Rachelle, because you don't just work, and actually neither of you just work in one sector. So although tons of experience in health, Rachelle, does anything strike you about the data that you've mined and explored today compared to other regulated sectors that really stood out or that struck you?
Yes, I think what was really interesting is when we do stakeholder research, which we do a lot of, and we're hearing from, different decision makers in this case, typically you tend to get variation in your response. You typically get a range of opinions, and that's very, very normal in a survey. What struck me about this survey was that the answers were so consistent. You saw the patterns, right? I mean, it was virtually everybody saying yes, yes, and a third, it's happened, it's happened, it's happened. So I think that's really important, is that this is not just one company or two companies in Canada. We had quite a number of people. When I say that, it was 43 strong. That sounds small, but that's not. So they were really answering consistently. The other thing that I would say is that the passion that came out from the stakeholders. This is a business topic, and this is with senior pharmaceutical executives. Not known to be the most passionate. I would say they were so passionate about this, and very strong opinions expressed, both written and also on the telephone interviews. The only other thing I would say is, just in relation to Mike's comment, one of the things I do find, and I found in this whole engagement from the start, it's a complex topic. It's a hard topic to communicate. But Canadians, this is actually something that can affect every Canadian. But articulating it, I think the way to articulate it is through COVID-19 and what's happened. And that's why I pointed to that op-ed, because I do find that that's one of the biggest challenges is, no matter how you feel about the opinion, just trying to communicate the situation, it can be challenging. So it's important that we clearly articulate what's at stake so that people can understand how they feel about it.
And thanks for that, Rachelle. The COVID dynamic has really come out of several of your points, and it brings me back to the mid 2000s when the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health was holding a plenary, their annual conference, and a very senior leader in the health system, was asked a question. The plenary panel was asked a question in about 2005. Why don't we just freeze the formulary? Why don't we just stop investing in new medicines right now and just give Canadians what we have and we're already paying for? Because from the floor they felt that they were already paying a lot, and it was mainly an economic question or discussion. And the answer from the leader was, you could do that, but what happens when SARS happens again? What happens when the next pandemic happens? And of course we had H1N1, and we were very fortunate to get through that. But we're now, basically over a year into the global pandemic, and that just resonated for me. And maybe I want to turn it to you, Jennifer, to expand on that COVID exception for vaccines and COVID therapies. Can you let us know, why the regulations would be a problem for those vaccines and therapeutics, and how important is it for Merck, for example? Anything that you can share there?
Yes, and thanks so much, Bill, for this question. This is hugely important. So this COVID exception that you mentioned, so that's the exemption of the COVID vaccines and therapeutics from the new PMPRB reform. This is, from a Merck perspective, from an industry perspective, from all of the innovators out there, this is hugely important. And it frankly shows just why these regulations are so problematic. So the fact that Health Canada decided not to apply the new price controls to COVID-19 vaccines and treatments, this is a clear recognition on their part that price and access are related, despite what some government officials who claim that there isn't a relationship. And we've seen this, right? So countries that are prepared to pay a competitive price for a new therapeutic and where there are clear pathways for commercialization, they will be selected for priority launches, securing supply and investment. So this exception, to come back to your question, Bill, is also incredibly important because it gives companies, like Merck, but all companies, small, medium, large companies, the certainty that's needed to focus focus our efforts and our resources on developing solutions for COVID-19 and not having to worry about, the challenges or the headaches of complying with these incredibly complicated and uncertain new regulations and resource constraints that they will cause. So, which at the end of the day, it means faster access for Canadians to these new treatments. So, I have to say, we have seen unprecedented levels of collaboration between government and private sector around COVID-19. And I sincerely hope we can carry this level of collaboration forward, not just for COVID-19, but also for all the other important disease areas. And if we look at cancer, like cancer in itself is a pandemic. And in fact, cancer has taken 5 times as many Canadian lives as COVID-19 just over the past year. And so when we think about, the early access to the COVID-19 vaccine, so how many Canadian lives could be saved if we had earlier access to medicines for other deadly diseases like cancer? So I think my policy recommendation or my policy plea would therefore be, for Health Canada and the PMPRB, we need to continue. We need to work in the spirit of collaboration that we've seen on COVID-19, and we need to consider a better approach to price regulation, one that's easier to understand and administer, and most importantly, doesn't serve as an unnecessary barrier to Canadians' access to new medicines. So again, I reiterate, I think this is an opportunity to essentially reset and reconsider the overall approach.
And thanks, Jennifer. I think actually you touched briefly on one of the questions that we're getting from the panel, from the participants, and so thank you. We've got several of them, but one of them was from somebody who has stage 4 cancer, and they want to know, if anyone's actually thinking about them. So, thank you for bringing that forward as one of the leading oncology companies. Maybe we'll just turn it back to Jason briefly, and then we'll go back to some of the questions that have come in. What have you taken away from this discussion, and what is LSO's plan to bring some of this data forward and share it beyond this webinar and days like today? What's happening tomorrow for LSO on this issue?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. As we were listening to this, I actually just had a message pop up on my phone when Rachelle was presenting. One of my colleagues who's not in the pharma industry, but other parts of life sciences, is on the line watching this and messaged me, "Wow, this is really scary." That was the response, and I think many people that are seeing this data are having that same sense that these are real impacts. And it's scary what we're seeing, especially in light of all the things that we've learned around COVID-19 and the need for us to continue to invest. And not only that, but the delays in treatment in other areas that have been caused because of COVID-19. And we've heard terminologies like a tsunami of cancer and other disease areas that are coming post-pandemic. And we are going to then handcuff our world-class physicians by not giving them the best tools, to manage the next health crisis that's on the horizon, which will be this backlog of patients and increased disease states. So those are things that are of huge concern for us. Bill, just to answer your question really quickly, in terms of getting this information out there and using this information, first of all, everything that we have done around PMPRB, we have made public and we have made available. And this is no different. We will have all of this information available on our website. You can go, you can find it, and it's lifescienceontario.ca, and will all be public and available. But moreover, we're going to be sharing this quite broadly. We've had lots of requests from media outlets. We've sent out a press release today, and we're also communicating directly with politicians at the federal level, at the provincial levels, that we've been in communication since day one on this issue. We've also leveraged our partnerships with other life sciences associations across Canada, national associations, and provincial associations who all share our concerns. So they're all sharing this information through their networks as well. And finally, Bill, there's also the HESA committee, Standing Committee on Health, that's reviewing these PMPRB regulations. And of course, we will be communicating this data to them, because this is great evidence to show some of the impacts that are taking place. And really, that's our ultimate goal, is we want to bring to bear real science, real evidence, real data into the decision-making process.
And today's a great start for that, bringing that data forward. We've got 5 minutes left. Rachelle, do you want to jump in and go?
I really want to add something. I think, there were some comments around to the stage 4 cancer speaker who sent a message in. First of all, my sympathies, absolutely. Not a good situation to be looking at. One thing I do want to say that really struck me in the interviews was one of the decision makers, and a couple actually, had talked about how we are on the verge of incredible science. Like, we are at the tipping point of some incredible breakthroughs. Look how fast the vaccine came. My goodness. But in oncology in particular, we are in targeted therapy land. We are in all of these breakthrough innovations. And just at the time when all of these amazing medications are coming in, Canada's taking this giant step backward. And we are 2% of the global market. We are not a top dog to be barking loudly. So I think that's very important to think about as well.
Thanks, Rachelle. We're not going to have time to get to everything, but I do want to just give a smattering of what the participants on the line have been chattering about, in addition to the one that I mentioned. One of them suggesting that some of the global executives and leaders share with the government, particular examples of a new product that was not launched or cannot come here and explain how and why. I think that one of the reasons that the research, et cetera, data was developed as it was anonymous. I mean, it's actually blinded from Life Sciences Ontario in terms of who responded and et cetera. It makes things really clear around some therapeutic areas, but I think that questioner probably knows that you can't necessarily broadcast that is not going to come externally. Not all companies are in a position to necessarily do that, but they should be able to speak to government and say, look, this is problematic for X, Y, and Z, according to one of our participants online. And a couple others say, this panel has done a good job of boiling down the issue. It's so complex, but it's actually not in terms of the situation that Canada finds itself in with COVID, where people are faced with a global supply challenge and a development challenge and huge demand across the country. And I think that really came out. A lot of you brought that forward, that this is almost a living example of how and why we need clear pathways for access and to support development and all that. Any final words from our presenters or panelists, and then I'll maybe turn it over to Jason to close us out. Mike, Jennifer, Rachelle.
Sure. I have one. Coming out of COVID, or even today, governments are very rightly going to say there's a dollar issue, there's a revenue issue, there's a cash issue, there's a lot to spend on across a whole range of areas, and we need to prioritize where we spend and where we fund. I've been doing this job at Ipsos for almost 24 years, and in government for about 10 years before that, 12 years before that. In that 30 plus years, when we ask people, and we ask them every month, what are your top issues? One of the top two, or at worst the top three, but often the number one issue, is healthcare. It doesn't matter whether 9/11 happens. 9/11 happens and terrorism rises and it comes back down and health stays. The economy falls, jobs go up and it comes back down. COVID comes up, but healthcare stays because it's very personal and it's a priority for Canadians, both the system, both at the personal level. So when they go to prioritize these things, it's always surprising to me that, they look at these areas and say, we've got to look at affordability because we have to prioritize. Where if Canadians did it, their priority would be in these kind of areas ahead of other potential areas where they can spend. So just it's not going to go away as an issue for governments, I guess is my point.
Thanks very much. Jennifer, any closing words?
Yeah, no, Bill, I just wanted to add, the COVID pandemic has shown that, government and industry, we can come together and work together and find solutions to huge global public health challenges. So surely we can be able to come to the table and talk about, a better, solution forward in lieu of these detrimental reforms. And I think really, again, it's to focus on getting through COVID-19, preparing for the next pandemic, but also really looking at, finding constructive solutions forward to deal with and address, getting the new cancer therapies out to all of the cancer patients who so deserve it. So I think it's just really, frankly, hopefully, government has seen that, they can sit down with pharma. We don't have kind of two horns going out of our heads and a tail, that we can work together, and we need to. And it's not just for COVID-19. It's for all of the other disease therapies and all the patients who are counting on us.
I was just thought that Jennifer's voice was echoed in my decision makers. That was going to be my final comment, is the decision makers wanted to tell the government they're ready to come to the table. They're not saying no changes on pricing reform. They understand the need to control pricing, but not this way. It's complicated, it's uncertain, it's creating havoc. Go back to the table. That was the voice from the decision makers.
Thank you. And maybe Jason, just to echo what you said before in terms of where folks can get access to the reports, I'll just remind people that there's the GoToWebinar control panel. They're actually all available in English and French as handouts. You can actually download them from this panel. But here's a couple of the websites that you can go and follow or share, et cetera, as you wish. And I don't know, Jason, anything we need to, we're at the top of the hour, any last words for the panel?
Yeah, I'll be really quick. I just want to thank everybody for all of their thoughts and their participation. And, I'll leave you with this one thought as well. As we look at the road ahead of us and we're thinking the immediate need, the short-term need, and the long-term need, I think of the 3 R's. It's rescue, recovery, and it's resilience. And our industry is poised to pull us out of this pandemic. It's poised to help us recover economically, help our backlogged health system recover, and build long-term resilience, which we need. And we've shown that, as Mike pointed out, if we look at decisions made in the past, we need to make those decisions now for future situations like this. PMPRB is a direct roadblock to the path ahead. So let's get it out of the way. As we were saying, we're willing to negotiate and go back to the table and have talks about how we can implement this in a way that isn't devastating for us to achieve the common goals that we need to. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, so thanks so much for everyone on the panel's time, Mike and Rachelle, for your and your team's really hard work to bring all of this together. Jason, for your leadership in making this happen, and of course Jennifer within the industry to be at the front lines on COVID and cancer and other huge health issues. That's actually something that came through on the questions panel too. And of course, we had well over 100 people participate today. We didn't get to all of your questions and comments, but we will take them back, and you know how to get in touch with Life Sciences Ontario if you want to keep the conversation going. Thank you all. Stay safe. Have an excellent afternoon and a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers up.
Bye, everyone.